Thank you, Margot, for that introduction, and thank you all for having me. So I'm going to speak to you all today on the topic of confronting inequities and data biases in travel demand analysis. So to start with some motivation, I want to share with you a few notes on the state of income inequality in the United States and inequity in the United States. I think many of us are aware of the current extreme case of income inequality as represented by the amount of economic growth that has accrued to the top 1%, or the top 0.1%, excuse me. As of 2020, we know that this is to the tune of 196 times that of the bottom 90% of earners in the United States. And to add some context, this is because over the past 4 decades, the majority of economic growth, estimated at $50 trillion, went to the top 1% rather than going to the bottom 90%. So this is equivalent to about $42,000 on average for the median full-time worker in the United States. So when we talk about equity, it's about many of the things that we are familiar with. It's about the fair distribution of opportunity, fair distribution of power, fair distribution of outcomes. It's also about fairness in data. It's about fairness in the algorithmic outcomes. It's about fairness in the decision-making process. But I also submit to you that it's about fairness, it's about the health and stability of our economy. Inequity jeopardizes our national economy by making society weaker and poorly equipped to respond in times of emergency. So I think in the United States, our initial poor response to COVID-19 and our slow relative recovery relative to other countries can serve as evidence. Inequality constrains economic growth in the literature. And all of these things together signify the urgency and the critical nature of addressing equity in many domains that we work in. So I'm a transportation engineer, and in transportation engineering and planning, we have a long history of investigating equity in decision-making for large transportation infrastructure that dates back to the 1950s and 60s. And so pictured here, you see images reflecting the aftermath of the construction of the interstate highway system, I-75 in Detroit. And this is just one case of many across the United States. So I think many of us are aware that this same case occurred over and over throughout the United States. And there were some 1 million Black and minoritized residents who were made to be displaced in order to make way for the Eisenhower interstate system. So this is evidence of how decisions that we make, if done without investigating impacts to vulnerable communities, can result in devastating consequences. So we understand that there are inequities from a historical context, but I want to also present that these inequities persist today. So one of the advocates of big data, we have data available from transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft that can be combined in experiments and experimental design to shed light on disparities when it comes to the quality of service across racial groups. So for example, there was a study that found that nearly 50%, or nearly a 50% higher occurrence in terms of cancellations in Uber and Lyft trips, and much longer, significantly longer waiting times when it comes to Black travelers in comparison to the counterparts. We also know that federal funding for transportation tends to prioritize heavy rail, even though we know vulnerable communities tend to benefit more so from local bus services. And we're also aware that vulnerable communities tend to experience a significantly greater exposure to various types of transportation pollution, even though they're less likely to contribute to emissions in terms of VMT and so on. So with that as motivation, I study how to confront equity in travel demand analysis. And for those who are unaware, travel demand models are computational tools that are often used in mid to long-range forecasting of transportation plans and decisions. They can be used to decide for or against large transportation infrastructure, like expanding certain types of transit or highway expansion, or even mitigating traffic congestion using traffic control mechanisms. And these models are widely used for transportation decision-making, and they can drive up to 200 billion in annual transportation spending at the federal and state levels. So in order for us to confront bias, representativeness, equity in transportation decision-making, it includes the following. It includes our data collection process. It includes how we expand the data. It includes our modeling and estimation phases, as well as our calculation of performance metrics using these models. Why are all of these phases so important? Because these are probabilistic models that are empirically estimated. So in my work, I've spent the last few years studying the data collection phase, and in particular, focusing on biases associated with the survey data collection. Now, although we have access to vast amounts of big data in transportation, produced from smartphone utilization, app utilization, and so forth, with regard to travel demand models, these models are still primarily estimated using classical household travel survey data. So let's talk about how these data can become biased. So we are aware that there may be non-coverage bias that occurs, and this is when certain participants are simply missing from the sampling frame. We know that there might be non-response biases for those who are included in the sampling frame, namely unit and mainly unit and item non-response. And in terms of unit non-response, this is when participants are simply opting not to participate in the data set. And item non-response refers to those who are participating but deciding which questions they want to respond to. There's also significant evidence that sometimes the survey modes, so whether it's paper or online or mobile, sometimes the survey modes don't necessarily align with the needs of the target group. So I'm speaking to issues connected to the digital divide, issues connected to literacy that might overall serve as barriers for target communities to participate in surveys. And a couple of notes from the literature. So we know that these types of non-response biases are more prevalent for disadvantaged communities, so low income, elderly, underemployed, transit dependent, and so on. We also know that there are a range of solutions that are offered in the literature and that many of us here study, things like the benefits of increasing the sampling size. And so this is one of the reasons why big data is so attractive, because it improves our capacity to collect data, but also other solutions like sophisticated data stratification techniques, data imputation, sample weighting, and so on. But the primary challenge for data science and estimating of these travel demand models is that we tend to assume that the data that we have available actually gives us the complete picture. In other words, we assume that any errors that might exist in the data are ignorable errors. And this presents significant issues. Further, there's a big question around the policy implications. So if we have survey issues where certain groups may be poorly represented in the data, what are the policy implications? What does this mean for decision making? And so this is a big unknown. So now what I want to do is to contextualize these policy questions. We know that there's a historical context for inequity in transportation decision-making. We know that these transportation inequities persist today, and this is observable in the data, but let's talk about what the decision-making implications are. So say that we have Vanessa and Susan, and we're using Vanessa and Susan to represent two demographics for which we want to estimate job accessibility. This is a common objective in transportation planning. We're using the above simple utility function to represent our model as a means of calculating accessibility to a downtown location where there are 100 jobs available. Now, if Vanessa and Susan have the same conditions, they live equidistant from downtown, they have the same access to modes and so forth, then our model would predict that they have the same level of attractiveness to traveling downtown. However, what if there are biases unknown to the analyst and not reflected in the data, like discrimination with regard to the labor market? So in this case, what if there are 25 companies that are less likely to hire Vanessa? What this would mean, or this would result in reality, a reduction in her accessibility to being employed downtown. However, our model would predict that Vanessa and Susan have the same level of accessibility because this is an unknown that is not reflected in our data. Now, what if we, for whatever reason, we didn't have access to data from Pam or Lydia, we didn't have access to data from Vanessa or Susan, and we used Pam and Lydia's responses to reflect their demographic. However, while Lydia lives in a similar neighborhood as Susan, Pam lives on average, or her demographic on average lives closer to downtown. This would result in an increase in our estimate or our calculation of accessibility for Pam and Vanessa's demographic group, which would be an incorrect prediction from our model. So these two simple cases are reflections of what the ramifications are if we, for example, have prevalent social issues like racial discrimination in various domains, if we have non-response that is systematically more prevalent for certain groups, and in this case, they are on average living closer to downtown than they do in reality. This is how our travel models might lead us to assume that working downtown is more attractive than it actually is for various demographics. So with that, I'll summarize. So equity is, among many things, tied to the economic strength and resilience of an economy, and this makes addressing equity even more urgent and critical. We are aware that vulnerable communities suffer from inequitable decisions of the past, as well as impacts of new transportation services today. And then responding to the question of how we can advance equity in travel demand models, there are a number of solutions that my team is working on, but I think primarily we need to denormalize the use of data as if it gives us the complete picture and work towards advancing incorporation of the likelihood of the data or probability of responses from various groups in transportation data analysis. And that's it. Thank you so much.